Hello everybody, welcome to number 27. I'm Jack, and although you might not be able to tell from my accent, I am actually Italian of origin. I came to the UK when I was 6 years old and I've been here ever since, and I absolutely love it here. But I have to say that when it comes to cars, my sort of nationalistic heritage does come to the fore, and I am really quite proud of what the Italians have achieved, mostly. That is apart from about 5 exceptions. In at number 5 is the Alfa Romeo Arna. It is definitely, for me, the worst product that Alfa Romeo ever came up with, and it's a little bit of a travesty, really. Now, there's 2 reasons that gave birth, let's say, to this abomination. One of them was that in the early 80s, most of the Japanese car makers were facing barriers into Europe. Most countries had put quotas into how much they could import from Japan in order to protect their car industry. So the Japanese car makers were quite keen to find other ways into the European market. The second thing is that Alfa Romeo had stopped production of the Sud. It had started production of the 33, but the 33 was a sort of a rung higher up in the market, so they needed something to sit below that, but they didn't have enough money to develop a brand new car. From that was born Alfa Romeo Arna, which is Alfa Romeo Nissan Automobili, or Alfa Romeo Nissan Motor Cars. Now, in principle, this was a fantastic idea because you could have combined Italian design with Japanese reliability. And in actual fact, many of the other European car makers were quite worried about this project. Alfa Romeo had built some of the best driving and most accessible sports cars of the post-war era. And the Japanese were renowned for producing cars in their millions with a Swiss watch-like precision and incredible reliability, so the combination of the two could have been quite a thing. That is unfortunately absolutely not what happened. What happened was quite the reverse. It was a car that combined 80s Japanese design that was quite lackluster at the time. It isn't anymore, but it combined that with Italian running gear and electrics, so the worst of both worlds. Now, the Arna, I'm sure you'll agree, looked absolutely hideous. There was only so much they could do with that sort of basic Nissan Cherry platform, and they did make some changes to the front and the back of the car, but it still looked absolutely horrible. On top of which, Alfa Romeo took the front suspension from the Alfa Sud and adapted it for the Cherry, and then kept the Nissan-designed rear suspension, neither of which was bad if it worked properly in unison and if it was designed together, but these were 2 separate systems, so as a result, the car actually didn't handle particularly well either. Now, the Alfa engines weren't actually that bad, those flat 4s, but they were quite an old design, and certainly the electrics meant that when reliability came into play, it wasn't very good either. When we go into the cabin, you can see that it's a really weird mishmash of sort of Nissan and Alfa Romeo switchgear, with a complete Nissan design though looking dashboard. So a really bizarre car this, and all in all just 53,000 were produced, which I think is a small mercy. In at number 4, and we have the Maserati Quattroporte 2. This is the only front drive Maserati ever made, and it is absolutely the worst possible example of platform sharing ever. So nowadays, platform sharing actually works quite well, and companies like Volkswagen have managed to make it quite successful, whether you like it or not. But this, the Maserati Quattroporte 2, was an absolutely awful example. So it was made between 1974 and 1978, and it was during a period when Maserati was owned by Citroën. And one of the first cars that came out of that sort of cooperation was the SM, which I think is a wonderful car. For the Quattroporte 2, they actually used an extended version of that chassis. Talk more about that in a second, but the first Quattroporte that came out from Maserati was actually a fantastic car. It had a series of V8s from 4.1 to 4.7 litres, producing between 260 and 285 horsepower. And at one point in its time, it had a top speed of 158 miles an hour. It was the fastest saloon around. So a lovely thing. And it was replaced with this hideous monster. So as I said, the chassis and the running gear was based on an extended XM platform. It was designed by Bertone, and as you can see, it's certainly not one of his finest hours, but he probably was quite limited in what he could do with that existing chassis. But anyway, the design was awful. On top of that, it used the smaller 3-litre V6. It was no longer a V8. It produced 200 horsepower, so a good sort of a minimum of about 50, 60 horsepower less than the previous car. And at 124 miles an hour, it was much slower. And as mentioned, it was now front drive. The final nail in the head for the Quattroporte 2 was that Citroën had no money for type approval. So luckily, in a way, I suppose, it wasn't sold in most European countries. It was only sold in the Middle East and Spain, where they didn't need to get that. And overall, mercifully, just 12 of these cars were produced. In at number 3, and we have the first Fiat, I think the only Fiat, the Fiat Argenta. Fiat has never been known for producing big cars well. It's always had quite a bad reputation on that side. And in 1971, it produced the 132, which was a big saloon for the time. On paper, the 132 sounded quite promising. It had a really well-located live rear axle, it had twin-cam motors, and a 5-speed gearbox. However, when it came out, it was mocked for its poor handling. It rolled quite a lot, and it just wasn't a great car to drive. Notwithstanding that, in its 10-year production run, they still managed to sell over 1 million of these cars. So it was pretty successful. And one thing that we can say about the 132 at least is that it was quite a tidy, cohesive design. But it was replaced in 1981 with this. The Fiat Argenta. What a horrible hodgepodge. Not only does it look pretty hideous, but it retained all the running gear, which was already 10 years old, so a 14, 13-year-old design, from the 132. And the body shell was pretty much all changed, apart from the door frames, which were the same. It was a horrible redesign. In the interior, trying to make up for lack of quality, they went for a total massive over-design of it, and the interior looks pretty terrible as well. At least it still had some sort of decent engines, but Fiat then made it even worse by introducing a diesel option. This was a 77 horsepower diesel from an Iveco truck. And it made the Argenta even worse. This is now a super rare car in the UK, but I think that Classic Car magazine summed it up best by saying that it is now very close to extinction, but much like anthrax is quite a rare disease, this is a rare Fiat that you wouldn't necessarily want to own. In at number 2 now, and we're coming up to the first and only Lancia. In the 1960s, Lancia was actually a premium brand, and it produced some pretty fantastic cars. The Flavia, the Fulvia, the Flaminia, they were actually really well engineered and technically advanced. However, Lancia struggled to produce more than sort of tens of thousands or sell tens of thousands of cars per year. And it meant that it soon went bankrupt, and Fiat snapped it up in 1969. The Beta was supposed to be the new relaunch for the Lancia brand under Fiat. It's another car that on paper sounded really promising. It had double overhead cam engines, it had full disc brakes all round, fully independent suspension and a 5-speed gearbox. And for a saloon in the 70s, that was a pretty good spec. The hatchback version of the Beta was a really ugly thing, and the saloon version, which was called the Trevi, had one of the most bizarre interiors known to man. Despite this, the Beta was received quite well by the press at the time, and that was because it was a good car in the sense it was a good design and it drove really well. The problem with the Beta was that at the time, Fiat had sold the production and the rights of the 124 to the Russians. The Russians didn't have any money at the time, and they weren't going to pay them in cash, so they decided to pay them with Russian substandard Russian steel. As a result of this, but also poor rust proofing on the cars themselves, these were vehicles that would be rusty before they even got to the dealers. It was such a bad thing that, within a year they had to be bought back by Lancia. Quality was improved over the next few years, but the damage had been done and the car had to be withdrawn from the UK and the American markets. Now, I think that this is singularly the biggest downfall and the biggest step down for Lancia's reputation, and has led to what has happened today, where Lancia has almost disappeared. In at number 1 is a Ferrari, and this is a Ferrari that I don't think you'll be expecting. It's not because Ferrari only produced great cars. I mean, they did produce some rotters. The 400, for example, comes to mind. But what makes this quite interesting, I think, is that in itself, it's not actually a terrible car. The reason why I picked it and the reason why I hate it so much is because it's so much worse than the car that it is evolved from. The car that I'm going to talk to you about is the Ferrari 512M. It's a derivative or an evolution of the original Testarossa. The Testarossa came out in 1984 and it used the running gear from the 512 VB. It was never really designed as an out-and-out sports car. It was more supposed to be a big tourer. The problem with the 512 VB was that it cooked the occupants in the cabin because of the way the pipes were routed. And also, it didn't have enough luggage space for that intended role. So the Testarossa was made much wider, much longer, and as a result, you can sit comfortably in the cabin and you have enough room to take some luggage with you. It was never a great handling car because that flat 12 engine sits on top of the gearbox, so the centre of gravity is way too high. But as an example of 80s excess, it's still a fabulous car. In 1991, the 512 TR came out, which was a facelifted version of the Testarossa. It still looked fantastic. It used some wheels which are a little bit more up to date with the current models, had a few other touches, looked great. It had a useful extra 45 horsepower, and I think that was a good redesign. The problem was that in 1995, Ferrari should have just pensioned that car off. Instead, they tried to update it one last time, and they made the 512M. And this car is such a disaster. I remember I was in Italy at the time. I think I was visiting relatives, and I was on a train, and I'd bought an Italian car magazine, and I was looking at upcoming cars. And I saw this thing, and I honestly thought, oh wow, it's a new Mitsubishi. I mean, nothing against Mitsubishi. They do make some good cars, but I just thought, oh, that must be a new Mitsubishi. That one looks a bit hideous. And I looked at it and I couldn't believe it. This was a Ferrari. And what they'd done, obviously, they tried to update it. It's got faired-in headlights, which look absolutely hideous. I think they were forced to do that because pop-up headlights were becoming, I think, illegal at the time. But it wasn't just that. They tried to smooth it over. And as a result, everything that was good, all those sharp lines, were just diluted, melted, and looked absolutely awkward. The front end, the front grille, that area was too busy. The wheels looked horrible. At the back end, they sort of tried to ram in some round lights for a car that was designed for square lights. And again, really unsuccessful thing. The roofline and those side strakes had to stay and didn't fit in with the rest of the design. So everything was really out of kilter. 500 of these monstrosities were built, and it is by far my least favourite Ferrari. That might be controversial, but that's definitely how I feel about this car. And what makes me really angry is just that the basis, the 512 TR, I think is wonderful. It's a wonderful looking car. How could you make something so much worse? Certainly these aren't the only bad cars that were made in Italy, but for me they are the standout options. Do let me know what you think. Is there anything worse that maybe I should have mentioned? There probably are a few. But on the whole, I think Italy has made some fantastic cars. Thank you so much all for watching. Please do subscribe if you haven't already. I really look forward to seeing you for the next one. And if you want to follow me on Instagram or you need to message me, that's the best way. And that's how you can reach me. Thank you so much.